All right, guys. So I'm gonna continue from where I was talking before was talking about um, the bombs, right, and how scary these bombs and their creation were, and to still are, right. It's not something that we talk about like all of maybe as much as like when I was a kid, but they're still around, right? And so obviously a huge part of the Cold War was this arms race, right? The development of these atomic bombs. And so I want to kind of move forward into this next part, which is the conversation of this guy right here, right? So Joseph Stalin, Stalin, right? He died in March of 1953, which created sort of a power vacuum in the Soviet Union. And eventually emerging out of this power vacuum is this guy right here, whose name is Nikita Khrushchev. Um, and so he's an interesting guy. He is sort of this bipolar character in this Cold War saga because depending on the day, depending on the events, you'd hear him talking about burying capitalism and wanting to take down the United States. But then the next day, again, depending on the situation and maybe who he talked to or whatever, he'd be talking about the fact that we needed peaceful coexistence. So he was a really interesting character in this drama. And one that plays a very important role, especially throughout the 1960s. Another thing that is really important is we saw what happened in China, and when I say we, I mean the West, the Americans, and the British and the French, the Canadians, right? So we saw what was happening and in China, and we were worried, right? Just like with Europe, that these dominoes would fall, right? This becomes known as the domino theory. This idea that like once a country fell to communism, right, that the surrounding countries would also tip and fall, and so we attempted to replicate what we did with NATO in the southeastern part of Asia. And so we tried to create what was called the Southeast Asia Treaty, right? CETO. Only the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan joined. And again, it was an attempt to combat communism in Asia. Um, it's not going to work, right? Obviously, because we're going to have other stuff happen, but especially Vietnam. But it raises the question, which again is for another day, another conversation of the poverty in Asia, right? And I don't say that as in like it's a part of who they are, but the poverty that had been created because of imperialism, because obviously Asia is rich and beautiful in culture and resources, but the poverty that had been left because of imperialism comes back to bite imperialism in the butt, right? Because a lot of these Asian countries are really going to be enticed by, communism. So, looking at the Middle East, right? So, the Middle East is also going to be faced with the dilemma of who do we side with, right? Do we side with Russia? Do we side with the United States? And really, a huge interest in the Middle East begins to really take place, during and after World War One, specifically surrounding the issue of access to oil and transportation. And so we're looking here at Egypt, right? So the United States had agreed to lend cash to the man who was in charge of Egypt at the time, at the end of the war, a guy by the name of General Gamal Abdul Nasser. And so they wanted to build a dam on the Nile River. And so the United States said, well, we'll give you money to build the dam, right? And so the United States wants access to the Nile River, right? Mediterranean, seaport, the Red Sea, right? So we want to also be able to have access, right? So, but he refused. And so what he actually wanted was he wanted weapons. He wanted the United States to supply Egypt with weapons, and the United States said no. We'll give you cash. You give us access. And so he said no. And so of course, having to choose, he chose to begin diplomatic relationships with the Soviet Union in 1956, right? Nikita Khrushchev. And so, as a result of that, the United States withdrew its money, its loans to Egypt. This leads to a crisis, right? So, if you can see here, right, not having access to the what eventually becomes the Suez Canal and the damming of the river and everything else, right, means that it becomes really expensive, right? So Nasser decides, well, I'm going to nationalize the canal, right? The canal will now become Egypt's instead of becoming this sort of internationally controlled port. So France, Great Britain, and Israel decide that they are going to attack Egypt, right? And Eisenhower freaks out. President Eisenhower, Ike, who becomes president of the United States again, right, in 1952. He freaks out and is like, oh no, like we're going to have this war in the Middle East, right? And again, Egypt is not part of the Middle East, but it's considered the regional part of the Middle East. And so this, he's afraid that that's going to happen. And then, so because of negotiations, a ceasefire is signed in November 1956. But this leads Eisenhower to really begin thinking about communism in the Middle East. And so in January 1957, he issues his famous Eisenhower Doctrine, which is basically borrowing from the Truman Doctrine, right? And so, again, it's very reactive, but the idea is that the United States will come to the aid of any Middle Eastern country or, again, the region of North Africa and the Middle East that is under the threat of falling to communism, right? So then a series of meetings begin to take place. Things are looking on the up and up a little bit in terms of, again, peaceful coexistence. So a meeting takes place. So a meeting had already taken place in Geneva, Switzerland in 1954, and that meeting is more connected to Vietnam, which we'll come back to later. But another meeting takes place in Geneva, Switzerland in 1955. Eisenhower's there, Anthony Eden of England is there, and Edgar Faure is there of France. And then, of course, Nikita Khrushchev is there. So what did they discuss at this meeting? They discussed disarmament. So they basically in 1955 were like, yeah, we're building a lot of weapons. We should probably not build as many. And they also began discussing the possible reunification of Germany, which, of course, because of the blockade back in the late 40s, had created this two-part Berlin and Germany. Then, in October 1958, continuing these talks, the Russians and the Americans decided that they would suspend atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, which was really important. Eisenhower and Khrushchev, right, volunteered the action. This eventually leads in 1963, which comes later, to what is called the Limited Test Ban Treaty, where the Soviets and the Americans agreed that there was going to be rules in terms of testing nuclear weapons. Then in the summer of 1959, at the time, Vice President Richard Nixon gets to visit the Soviet Union. As a reciprocal thing to do, we invited Khrushchev to tour the United States in 1959. And it's pretty funny because we actually had him tour like this warehouse-looking thing that had like all the TVs and all of the home sort of technologies and what the United States and the good of capitalism. And so in the middle of this makeshift kitchen, Nixon and Khrushchev on national television began speaking about what their dialogue was. And so they called them the kitchen debates because they were in this makeshift kitchen. And it was pretty funny because Nixon started talking about how, all of these American developments and technologies and blah, blah, blah. And Khrushchev gets on and to a nationally televised audience, he goes on there and he's like, "Niet, niet, niet," right? He's like, while you Americans are building kitchens and toasters and stuff, he's like, we're busy trying to figure out how to put a man on the moon. We're busy putting Sputnik up in 1957, right? And so it's interesting, right? Because instead of like it convincing him, right, to maybe, sort of begin looking at what we were doing as something good, he's like, no, look at where we're putting our resources in. Which, can be a little scary for the American audience. Then all of this good faith goes out the door. Even though everybody was doing this, we got caught, right? So on May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane, which, by the way, the band U-2 is named after. Conversation for another day. Is shot down over Russia. And so the pilot, a guy by the name of Francisco Gary Powers, was captured. And so there was going to be a big meeting that was going to take place in Paris, in Paris, in 1960, and it gets called off, right? Because Khrushchev's like, screw America, right? Again, we need to bury capitalism again. So then I want to talk a little bit about how this all began to sort of play out in Latin America, which, by the way, right, is relatively closer to us than some of these other areas, right? So I want to start off with Guatemala. And before I do, I want to talk a little bit about my own family. And so, like I was telling you guys, I mentioned in class, I mentioned at the beginning of the year, my grandparents were born in Spain. My mom's parents, that is. And so my grandmother was born in Sevilla and in Andalusia, which is very different from La Mancha or Madrid in terms of regions. And then my grandfather is Catalonian and Basque, born outside of Barcelona. And so they did not like the result of the Civil War, right? And Spain between 1936 and 1939. So in 1941, my grandparents decided that they needed to leave España. My grandfather, Francisco, he decided that he was going to relocate to, and this is, my grandparents have only been married for a few months. They decided that they were going to move to El Salvador in Central America, and this is the connection here, right? And so my grandfather, his two older brothers, lived there already. They were landowners, which again is a story for another day, right? My grandparents were basically going to be my grandfather more than my grandmother, because my grandmother is very different, or she was very different than my grandfather in terms of her ethnic background, being that she had North African and Middle Eastern, and being from the south of Spain. But my grandfather was very white, dirty blonde hair, green eyes, and so the family is very white, blonde hair, dirty blonde hair, blue eyes, green eyes, right? They were essentially white in a brown country, if you may, for lack of a better way of saying it. So my grandfather, my grandmother moved there, and they took advantage. So it's interesting, the irony, the paradox, of course, is leaving a country because of civil war, because of fascism, only to go to a country where you can essentially have power, right? That's the paradox of my family. So they go there, and so my grandfather became a professor at one of the universities there. Honestly, I don't know which university, because it's not something that we talk about too much in my family. And right around the same time, post World War II, a movement began in El Salvador. And this movement came as an anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism movement, like happened in Asia, like happened in other countries in Latin America prior to that. In Africa, we'll see this, right? This anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism movement. And in El Salvador, it was started with a man by the name of Farabundo Martí. And he was a campesino, he was a farmer, and educated, and he started this movement to try to reform El Salvador. And he wanted to overthrow the United States-backed, right? This is, again, another example of these proxy wars. He wanted to overthrow this United States-backed sort of colonial imperialistic government in El Salvador. And so my grandfather eventually left the university and decided to become a professor, or excuse me, he decided to go and start working for the federal government. So my grandfather became a congressman in the Salvadorian Congress, the national government. And a civil war eventually broke out in El Salvador between for lack of a better word, this rebellious group against the government, the FMLN, the Farabundo Martí Liberación Nacional, which is the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Movement, again, to overthrow a U.S.-backed government. Civil war in El Salvador will rage on for years. And so my grandfather, like I said, is part of the national government while this is all going on. And so I want to fast forward to the 70s. So my father, Luis, he became a police officer. And I only found this out a couple years ago, but my father was actually a narco cop, which is a stories again in and of themselves, stories embedded into these stories. So my grandfather was a cop, and the way that my father and mother met was on a bus. My mother was on her way to school, university, dropped her books. My dad picked them up, and was like, "Sup, girl," but more like, "Hey, qué pasa, mujer," in Spanish, right? And so eventually, my dad. Was handpicked by the United States ambassador to El Salvador to be one of his bodyguards. Okay. In 1976, my family, because the United States ambassador needed to go back home, asked my dad to come with him. So my mom and dad moved to Southern California with the United States ambassador in 1976. Fast forward, I am born in March of 1977. While this is all happening, my grandfather decided to leave the federal government, go back into teaching. Just the Civil War was raging; it was too much for him. Didn't like it, right? So in 1977, I was born in March, and right around June, July, the ambassador needed to go back to El Salvador because of stuff that was happening. So everybody moved back. So I moved back to El Salvador in 1977, or I moved to El Salvador, I should say, for the first time in 1977, and I was there for 2 years. And I turned 2 years old in March of 1979, and then in May of 1979, we were at my grandfather's house. My grandfather was outside gardening in his front yard with my mom, and I was in the house with my mom's youngest sister, who's only 9 years older than me. And a truck pulls up in front of my grandparents' house. And one of the things I want to remind you guys is that while this quote unquote civil war is happening, the civil war is really a proxy war, right? Where the United States government is, or the Salvadorian government is backed by the United States, and the FMLN is now at this point being backed by the Soviet Union. Okay? So a truck pulls up, and 3 men get out of the truck. These 3 men are part of the Farabundo Martí Liberación Nacional, this movement. And they yell out, "Francisco Castro," to which my grandfather stands up and says, "Sí, soy yo." Yes, it is me, in front of my mom. And the 3 men decide to pull out their shotguns and, in front of my mother, blow away my grandfather. And I'm having a hard time telling the story without getting emotional, but I'm going to try. And so my grandfather is shot by these men. And my mom, he died in front of my mom. They ran away because one of my mom's brothers came out and began shooting at them with a revolver. So they ran. My grandfather died in front of my mom, in my mom's arms. And my mom has a scar on her left hand from the shotgun pellets. She still to this day has pellets lodged into her knee, into her right knee, that she's never been able to have removed. And then 2 months after that, the United States ambassador was leaving the embassy, and there was an attempted murder of him. And so there was a drive-by at the embassy, and my father, having just experienced the loss of his father-in-law 2 months earlier, gets shot in the chest, throwing himself in front of the United States ambassador. So my dad has a huge scar on his chest from this event. And the family decided that was it. And so everybody moved. My grandmother, my mom's siblings, there's 9 of them. Everybody moved. My father, everybody was able to get visas because of the ambassador. The reason I tell you that story is because that story repeated itself all over Latin America. That story repeated itself in Asia, right? Those of you that are Vietnamese, we're talking about South Vietnam versus North Vietnam here, right? And whose perspective of the story you get. And the story sort of continued because when I was in college, I wrote a paper in support of the FMLN, the same group that murdered my grandfather. I wrote a paper supporting where they were coming from, their perspective, not supporting the murder of my grandfather, but supporting their frustrations and everything else. And my mom found the essay, and my mom read it and decided that she was really angry and didn't speak to me for like 2 months. To this day, my mom and I have never spoken about that essay. So anyway, really sad. But the reason I tell you that story is, like I said, it's one example of these proxy wars. And then another place where this was happening was Guatemala. So Guatemala and the United States government. So the guy that was president of Guatemala in 1954 was a guy by the name of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, and he was a United States-backed president. And so there is going to be an overthrow of him by a Soviet Union supported rebel. And so, anyway, or excuse me, I screwed up on that. Sorry. I'm thinking about my family and it threw me off. So, what happened was in 1954, there was I'm so sorry. There was a democratically elected government, and that government, the guy who took over was a guy by the name of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Okay, and the United States didn't like what had happened. Again, Soviet-backed, right? But it was a democratically elected person. The reason the United States didn't like it is, again, because it would put the Guzman government, a Soviet-backed government, close to the United States. But the other reason that we didn't like it is because it meant that we were not going to be able to get all of the cheap resources in Guatemala. And one of those companies that was getting cheap resources is a company called United Fruit. Today, United Fruit is actually called Chiquita Banana. And so the CIA, along with Chiquita Banana, helped to overthrow the democratically socialist government, USSR-backed government of Arbenz, and replaced him with a series of American-backed government leaders or dictators, depending on how you look at it. And so this is a crazy situation that takes place. The Chiquita Banana family, the company, the United Fruit Company, actually supported a lot of what are called paramilitary groups that went in, a lot of torture stuff, and a lot of the torture methods that were actually taught to these CIA-backed people were actually instructed by former Nazis now working for the United States CIA, which is pretty crazy. Now, why is that important? Obviously, it's a proxy war, but it's also important because one of the men that's there is the man on the left, and this Argentine guy by the name of Ernesto Guevara, which people call him Che. The reason they call him Che is because Che is sort of like dude in Argentina, so he would say, "Hey, mira, sí, yo llorar, Che." And so Che was actually in Buenos Aires, or excuse me, in Guatemala when this was happening. And while this is happening, he decides he has to leave because he does not want to get arrested in Guatemala. So he makes his way up to Mexico City. And while he's in Mexico City, this Argentine man meets a man who has been exiled to Mexico, a lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro tells him that he wants to go back to Cuba and overthrow what is there a United States-backed government by a dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista. So what ends up happening is they go back, and in 1959 they overthrow the American-backed government there. And one of the very first things that Castro does is he calls the United States the evil empire, enters, of course, into a relationship with the Soviet Union, and then the United States places an embargo in Cuba in 1960, right? And that's kind of where the relationship has been. Now, things really get scary, right? Because the government controls the nuclear power, right? The atomic power that is being produced. And so one of the things that is agreed to is that that's not a safe idea. And so what ends up happening is that the government creates the Atomic Energy Commission, which basically means that the Department of Energy is created. And so instead of the president having control over the energy of the country, right, there's an actual, well, I mean, he still kind of does, right, or she eventually, hopefully, right, but there's now a civilian controlled and taken out of the hands of the military. Another thing that's really important is looking at some of the social stuff that's going to happen. And so I'm going to stop here only because I want to talk about this on Friday and next week with the rest of the class, okay?